Hello, Faith Community Church. Welcome to our daily devotional for today. I'm Brad Norman, Director of Christian Education and Assimilation, and I'm here with our senior pastor, Caleb Schroeder. And we're excited to be moving into a new book of the New Testament today. We're going to be moving from the book of Acts into the book of Galatians. Pastor Caleb, why are we doing Galatians next? Aren't we skipping over a couple of books in the New Testament here?
Yeah, so what we're doing as we read through the books of the New Testament, we did a series earlier talking about why we're doing the order we're doing. And what we're doing is we're looking at the epistles of Paul in chronological order. And so Galatians it's the earliest epistle that we have for Paul. Now there's some debate among scholars about that. And so let me just lay out really quickly sort of why we believe that this is the earliest epistle. Part of the debate revolves around who Galatians was written to. There's the ethnic Gauls who would have been in the south of Galatia, but the Romans called the whole province Galatia, and that included the southern region where the people weren't really ethnically Gauls. They weren't really, their ethnicity wasn't Galatians, but it was still called by the Romans Galatia. And so Paul is addressing this letter to the churches that are in Galatia, plural. And in his first missionary journey, he goes to some of those churches. You might remember he went to Iconium and Lystra. That's in southern Galatia. So we see that he's there on his first missionary journey. Also, when you read through the gospel, the epistle of Galatians, you see at certain points Paul's referring to events. And that helps us to place it. And he talks about going down to Jerusalem. And in Acts, we saw twice that he goes to Jerusalem. We see in Acts 11 and Acts 15. And so if we're looking at those two, we can try to figure out, he's referring back to this visit. It must come after this visit. Acts 11, this is sort of a private visit. We look at Galatians chapter 2. It seems like it's sort of a private visit. But even if it's the Jerusalem Council that we see in Acts chapter 15, it's still going to put this as a very early date. And we would date it about 48 AD. After his first missionary journey, maybe after that Jerusalem Council, maybe right before that first Jerusalem Council. We're not exactly sure. The argument from silence is it's probably before the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, because he doesn't mention that. And it would really make sense based on the content of this book that he would mention the Jerusalem Council if it was written after that. So probably early 48 AD. So we can really sort of narrow it down to early in the year 48 AD.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know Galatians was Paul's first letter, at least we're pretty confident in that. But now we need to get into the book itself. Why did Paul write this letter?
Yeah, so after Paul had shared the gospel, a group of people came in and they start trying to convince the Galatians, the different churches there, that they need to keep the Old Testament law in order to be saved. This group of people are called the Judaizers or the Judaizers. And as they come in, they're leading people away from the truth of the gospel. And this is his first epistle. These are brand new Christians. They're very easily shaken in their faith. And so Paul is writing specifically to counter that. He says this in Galatians 1:6. He says, I am amazed that you are so quickly turning away from him who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who are troubling you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. These two words right here, grace and gospel, are sort of central to his argument in the book of Galatians, and we'll see them throughout the text. He's explaining to them, this is the true gospel, this is the true good news that you've heard, and this is what grace really looks like. There's a lot of confusion in the church over grace, so he's really making a case for the good news of the gospel that I don't save myself, that Jesus has done the work that saves me.
Wow, this is an important letter then for us to be studying, focusing on the gospel. And right off the bat here, Paul gives us kind of a standard introduction, but as is often the case, in each letter he tweaks it a little bit. So Pastor Caleb, what is distinct about this particular greeting, this introduction to the letter?
So Paul offers a couple things that he says. He has his grace and peace from God the Father, but what's different about Galatians, he doesn't give them a commendation. Oftentimes he'll say, I thank the Lord when I remember you, or he talks about something that he's heard, some good news that he's heard about them, something that he can commend them for. Galatians, he gets right to it. And he sort of lets them have it right out of the muzzle. He just begins sort of laying into them, explaining, you guys are leaving the gospel. This is dangerous ground that you're walking on. He really sets the tone right from the beginning. This is a letter that's a warning to the church.
Yeah. And what does Paul say here about those who are distorting the gospel?
He doesn't pull any punches. He says, let them be cursed. And he even says this. He says, even if an angel comes from heaven, that angel needs to be cursed. And it's interesting, looking back through church history, how many cults we've had that have started because people have said, well, I received this message from an angelic being. We can see Islam. They have angelic beings who bring what? A different gospel. We have Mormons, the Latter-day Saints. They have angelic beings who've brought a different gospel. And Paul says, I don't care if it's an angel. And we need to remember that our enemy disguises himself as an angel of light. We do have enemies, and they can seem like they're for us, and they're against us. And Paul wants the church at Galatia to understand that these people need to be cursed if they preach another gospel.
So it's really important for us to know what the true gospel is and to be able to distinguish it from false gospels. Pastor Caleb, how is Paul's gospel proclamation different from what the Judaizers were preaching?
So he says in Galatians 1:10, for am I now trying to persuade people or God? Or am I striving to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, the gospel preached by me is not of human origin. Paul explains he's not coming to them in order to try to win them over to his camp. What he's proclaiming, he's doing for God. He's not doing it because he's trying to convince people to join his team or to join his side. He's doing it only in view of God. He sees himself as a servant of Christ. What he does not to please people, but he's doing it to please Christ. And that sets him apart. Everybody else, they're trying to get people to join their group. They sort of have this party spirit where they come and join my team. Like my logic is more sound. My argument makes more sense. Come and join my team. And Paul isn't interested in those things. He is interested in faithfulness to the message.
Why is it important that the people knew where Paul's gospel message came from here? He says it's not of human origin, as you read there.
Yeah.
Why is that important that the readers knew that?
Yeah, so he goes on in verse 12, he says, I did not receive it from a human source, and I was not taught it, but it came by a revelation of Jesus Christ. It's so important that people understand when they read Galatians, this is direct revelation that Paul has. And what's happened to the church ever since its very beginning, if people have come in and they say, hey, I have a new message, I have new revelation, and Paul says, no, I had this direct revelation from God. I have this message. It's not of human origin. I didn't come up with it. I didn't make it up. God gave this to me. And so the truth of the gospel is based on its source. It's not human source. It's not a human idea or ideals. It's based on what God gave to man through direct revelation through his apostle, Paul, right here.
Now, when we were going through the book of Acts, we saw the story of Paul and how he came to know the Lord Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. And why is it relevant that Paul had been trying to destroy Christianity before he wrote this letter, before he came to saving faith?
Something we saw throughout Acts is Paul repeatedly goes back to his testimony. It's probably the testimony that's recounted the most in the New Testament. Over and over again, we have this story. And Paul says later on that God saved him to show basically if God could save him as this chief of sinners, he could save anyone. And Paul constantly goes back to that, and he lets people know how drastic his conversion is. But he also wants the Judaizers to understand, I was like you. I was so into the only way you can be saved is through the law of Moses that I was willing to kill for it. And he wants them to understand this is how drastic my conversion is. I used to think like you, but I have been converted completely from who I was.
Yeah. So he came around on this, and he needed these Galatians to come around on this too, like he did, and to see the truth of the matter. One final question here. Why is it relevant that Paul was unknown to the Judean churches at the beginning of his ministry?
Yeah, so he explains his testimony. He didn't sort of just all of a sudden start having this amazing public ministry right away. He was unknown to the churches in Judea at the beginning of his ministry. And this is also an argument from silence. Like, why would he say that? Well, we have to understand he's countering a false gospel. And people are coming up who are saying that they're saved from most likely churches in Judea. And they're like, we don't even know who this guy is. We don't know who this guy is who shared the gospel with you. But what he said is not true. And Paul wants them to understand, okay, they might not have known about me at the very beginning of my ministry. This is also another argument for why it has to be an early epistle. They wouldn't have known about me, but I did go down to Jerusalem. I was known by Peter. I was not publicly known, but what I have been proclaiming was heard by them. They didn't hear my name, but they heard about me, because it says this in verse 23, they simply kept hearing, he who formerly persecuted us now preaches the faith he once tried to destroy. So he's letting them know, you might not have known my name, but you heard my story. So Paul's story spreads all over the place. So he's saying these people who are coming in, who are trying to convince you to believe in a different gospel, they even heard about my story, even if they didn't know my name. And this is something that Paul does. He defends himself as this one who has the right to proclaim the gospel. He is an apostle. And what's exciting is we see it right here in Galatians. In his very first epistle, he's letting us know, I am not just some person who decided this is what you should believe. I'm an apostle of God. I have the authority to proclaim this message because I've received direct revelation from God. People today don't have that kind of authority. And people in his day, if they weren't an apostle, they didn't have that sort of authority. And we see Paul do this frequently in his epistles, explain, I have the authority, I have the right to make this proclamation. No one else does.
Well, I hope you can start to see just how important and foundational this letter to the Galatians is. And so we're excited to lead you through this letter over the next couple of days here. We got 6 days in Galatians. So read along with us as we continue, and hope you'll join us tomorrow for our next devotional. See you then.
Thanks for listening.